Well, golly gee, gosh. It makes me sound either really old or kind of busy, but it all fits together. And in fact, I was going to start with something, but I'm going to do a teeny diversion because of what you talked about. Now, here's the serendipity for the night. In terms of POPs and IPEN, I happen to serve on the board of CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, which is the administrative host for IPEN. And in the way in which so much of what we all work on, I'm going to give you a teeny taste of an anecdotal story that's part of the political side of Matt's work. This year, 2012, is the 50th anniversary of the book Silent Spring. We all know Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And what she was talking about, that Silent Spring, her poetry and her prose that she brought to that, was really the first alarm that would sound to what we now categorize as POPs. And this is where the gender component comes in, because aside from the fact that she actually died from breast cancer a few years after that, she was resoundingly maligned and embarrassed is just not sufficient. She was just raked through the coals in the press because she was a woman. In 1962 and 63, pieces that were written about her were very dismissive because she didn't have children. They said, well, what kind of woman is she? You know, why is she out here trying to be a scientist and writing about these things? If you go, it's really jarring to read what was written about her then with 2012 eyes. But it was for me reading Silent Spring as a young girl that really, in a very concentrated way, took this naturalist background that I had received from my grandmothers, my maternal grandfather, and from my parents. My mother was a psychologist, clinical psychologist. My father was a mechanical engineer. His brother was an architect. And my maternal grandfather was an oncological surgeon. And my paternal grandmother finished Tuskegee in 1917. And her faculty advisor was George Washington Carver. And just to make the point that I didn't stand a chance of not getting to do some of these things, my maternal grandmother, who sang and studied German lieder, I was the only grandchild. So I wasn't just an only child, I was the only grandchild. So I had a lot of adults who were focused on me. But that's not the point I'm trying to make here. In terms of Silent Spring and that legacy, and understanding gender issues, fast forward to the Earth Summit, which you mentioned. So in the spring of 1992, in the final PrepCom in March, in New York at the UN, a group I worked with, which was called We Do, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, had convened a World Women's Congress for a Healthy Planet back in, well, at that point, the previous November. And so some of the women who had been part of that and who had learned about that had come to this final PrepCom to get ready for the Earth Summit. There was a woman there named Linda. I think her last name was Jackson. I know her first name was Linda. And she was so excited about her activism and what she had done. She was from Arkansas, and she had been working on issues around Agent Orange to get it, the production and disposal of it out of we'll call it her backyard. And she was standing up talking about it and then relaying this experience, and she was so proud of it. And then, when she finished, Martin Kaur came up. Now, Martin is from Malaysia, and he's one of the founders of the Third World Network. And Martin wanted her to understand, this was not an indictment of her, but he wanted her to understand that when she got the production removed from Arkansas, she and her civil society NGO group, they had moved to Malaysia. And And she was, I mean, you could just visibly see it just drained all of her, because her point was to get it stopped, not to get it moved. And so part of what, and I'm going to try several times to tie things back specifically to Royal Roads, but specifically to the role that the Academy plays more than any other single institution in helping us to have sufficient capacity to be thorough enough to really address the issues that face us today. She was devastated by that, but Martin said, don't be devastated, be my ally. We will work together. Now, you talked about POPs. I started as a 19-year-old kid in the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, and I worked on issues around Chlordane, a substance that never should have been made, is the way I think of it. It is beyond persistent. It just never goes away. If it's in a cinder block, I mean, I don't know what you do with that cinder block. It permeates everything. So I have since 1971 and 72 understood how critical it is for us to understand and make sure that mothers and fathers and children and others and people who run companies understand that we should not even make substances that have the potential to be that harmful. We don't need an elephant gun to get rid of dandelions. You can pick them. There are all kinds of things you do. They actually make pretty good greens. So anyway. So I had no intention of talking about either of those things, but when you brought that up with your information content, I couldn't resist showing that we have so many connections. Now, I'd planned to start, and so now I'm officially starting my presentation. So, the Chinese poet Wanzu, in the year 500 BC, said, "If you are thinking a year ahead, sow seed. If you are thinking 10 years ahead, do plant a tree. But if you are thinking 100 years ahead, educate the people." It is only the Academy that has the capacity to really help us remake the world. And listen hard for the remake, I'm going to repeat that. Because we are, in fact, doing nothing less than remaking the world. I happen to love the word remember. And after the so-called financial crisis of 2008, I kept hearing everyone talking about, well, we have to do this over again. We have to do this. And they kept talking about what was effectively a reset button. But if you reset the button on what you've already been doing, what's going to happen? You're going to get the same result at some point. And I thought about the fact that the word remember is an interesting word, because we always use remember, but we never talk about how you member something, because clearly at some point it had to be membered to be put together. So I like to think of us, we are now very, very self-consciously, through a lens of sustainability, remembering the world. We have to be careful that we do it with humility and not with arrogance. But we're not just resetting the button, we're reclaiming our past, we are renewing, and we are especially reframing to restart society in a way that brings the concepts of justice and equality and fairness in. We must do this in a way that is incredibly inclusive. We need institutions like Royal Roads, institutions that are committed to diversity, that are committed to being progressive. To me, I speak at an awful lot of campuses and schools, and I think the way in which this university is putting itself together to be maybe even more than a 21st century university, but to really be the kind of institution of the future to help prepare its students and its graduates to really be able to not just perform in companies, in government at whatever level, and in other institutions, but to truly be leaders, to define how we are going to be in the future. So I personally am just very, very impressed with everything that is going on at Royal Roads. I hoped that some of what we might do is to just sort of throw some of these ideas out, some of these pieces around different language, and I know it's getting a little later, but it's okay, to maybe engage you in some dialogue and question about these things. I know a few of you have been at the Globe conference this week. Many of you have not. I've had the pleasure of speaking at Globe, well, a lot. I think it's about my 10th time speaking at the biannual meeting. And one of the things that has happened, I'm really, really partial to this part of the Northwest, on the North American continent. And I think the positioning here really is critical in terms of the worldview that it affords you. Pacific Rim, yes. North American scope, yes. Part of the world, absolutely. Chris Henderson, who is the CEO of Loomis Energy and one of the co-founders, was the moderator this morning on the town hall that was the concluding session. And one of the things that he reminded us of, and it's something basically he was just saying, part of how we're having to have these discussions is he reminded the audience to be very Canadian. And that is something that, living through the politics that's going on in the United States right now, I long for some Canadianness. A sense to be truly respectful, and it doesn't mean that everything is milk and honey. I know better than that. But some of my, I say sheroes and heroes, happen to be Canadians. During the process of the Earth Summit, Elizabeth May and I first got to work together. And her daughter, baby Victoria, was just a few months old. And we have been best buds and tight colleagues since then. Michelle Landsberg, who is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, we were the co-chairs of the North American Women's Caucus together. And she's also a wonderful writer, and I got to know her daughter-in-law, Naomi Klein. And then I truly had the pleasure of several years of working with Ambassador Stephen Lewis, who is, I happen to think, perhaps the most eloquent person speaking the English language on the planet. And the work he did as the Special Envoy for AIDS for UNICEF, and the work he did at the UN, and he, perhaps more than any other person, is the reason that at the UN we now have what's called UN Women. He insisted that we cannot, as a global society, continue to have such patriarchal strains that are exclusive of women. And I hope you understand when I say patriarchal strains, that is not anti-male. That is merely saying that we lose too much valuable input and content if we do not seek ways and structures of including everyone in the process. The last sort of content point I just wanted to throw into our mix tonight. I've worked for a number of years for the last 18 years, I've been part of an organization that was initially called ZPG and has for the last decade been called Population Connection. I was intrigued by reading about population issues. I sort of stumbled across it one time from a philosophy course when I was a young kid. And yes, I was a strange child. I admit it. I used to read world books. I'd sit down with the volume in and just read it. I'd then go to C and S, but that was me. So does anyone know or remember, and if this is your area of expertise, please don't answer, but how long did it take us in human history to get to the first billion people on Earth? Does anyone know, or you have a guess? You want to guess what year that was that we sort of crossed the threshold of 1 billion people? Just try, yes? Well, it was actually earlier than that. It was 1804. And roughly, that was 200,000 years of time to get to that. So when did we get to 2 billion? Well, 1927. So that took 123 years to get from the first billion to the second billion. 33 years later, in 1960, we got to the third billion. Only 14 years later, 1974, we got to the fourth billion. Only 13 years after that, 1987, we got to the fifth billion. And the time continues to decrease. So 12 years later, we got to the sixth billion in 1999. And last October, we reached 7 billion. Now, I'm not standing here advocating, saying, that population is hard to talk about. And I tried to figure out, why is it so hard to talk about? Because you tend to talk about numbers of people and not babies. It's so hard to get our heads around the numbers, but it's so easy to get our arms around a child. And so part of what you have to do when you talk about this, to avoid being characterized as some callous, cruel automaton, is to recognize that the discipline of demographics is one of numbers, is one of policies around people disaggregated from their human selves. And if there's anything I care about the human self. But we have to be able to look at that as, how do we talk about this? Because knowing that there are 7 billion people on the planet now, that this past year, for the first time in history, more people now live in urban areas than do in rural areas. And that had never happened before in human history. That we are having mega cities that will continue to increase. There will be, if I remember correctly, there will be 25 mega cities that are over 20 million people each by 2025. Now, right now in Sao Paulo, they have 7 or 8 different sewer systems. And trust me, there are places that don't have a sewer system. There are gaps in that. And the demand that this will then place on our urban areas is huge. And where else but in the academy are we going to have the research and the thinking and the intellectual laboratory that will allow us to bring sobered, humane options and resolutions to these problems that face us so greatly. So as we try and remember the world, as we try and remake the world, we've got to do it with all of these disciplines and not in their silos. And I know I sound like a commercial, but it really is true. I mean, that's what, in reading through the curriculum and reading through the coursework, one of the things that you do at Royal Road so well is you allow for the cross-pollination and fertilization of disciplines in a way that really does allow for someone who may have come in interested in this part of this, but to see where all of the other disciplines impact the potential for the solutions and for the options. And then it gives you a laboratory, a living laboratory in which to test this. And that is so needed, particularly for people coming out to work in the real world of business. I've served on enough corporate boards and been part of enough different companies that what you don't need is someone who comes out who knows the box of how to do all the calculations, but doesn't know a single thing about the implications of any of those applications. You need to have that, and that's what you can get in this laboratory. I don't want to go on too long, but one of the ways in which, Megan, and I really thank you for inviting me, it just is such an honor for me to be asked to come and to speak to you. But one of the ways in which we first connected was at the women's luncheon, as she said. And as part of that luncheon, I made a little list up. So I'm going to close with this list. And it was, we had each time we've had this women's luncheon, and to the luncheon I always say we have good women and good non-women who come to the luncheon. All are invited. But each time we tried to figure out what are some of the pieces of wit and wisdom that we might be able to bring to the luncheon. Not more the technical information, but more of what's the passion that drives you, that supports you, that comforts you, that allows you to continue to do this work, to do it in a way that connects to other people. And in particular, you may have noticed my hair is graying. And so it means that I'm less young than I used to be. But I get so many young people who say, you know, well, actually, sometimes they say, I want to be you. And I say, oh, please don't do that. You want to be you. I said, if anything, I hope that the work that I have done and that others in my generation and my colleagues have done will make the path easier so you don't have to deal with, and I say this with that you don't have to deal with some of the crap that we had to get out of the way. Because if you have to go through the same stuff we had to go through, we have not done nearly as well as we should have. So here's a few items from the list that we said. The first thing was breathe. Just relax. There's going to be time to get it all done, and you don't have to do it all alone. The second was never, ever stop learning. Never stop growing. The reality is, for this generation forward, it is imperative that one be a lifelong learner, embracing the wonder and awe of what is to be discovered next. The third, and I look around the room, everyone's so young. The third is remember to stretch. Trust me, if you don't stretch, it will freeze. And one day you'll go to reach and you won't be able to. The fourth, in the United States, I don't know if it was so much here in Canada, but on our national public radio, there was a program, a series called This I Believe. And I just found it so compelling because it asked people to distill, what do you believe? And I always tell young people and students, spend some time. I mean, I'm very serious. Write your own essay. It doesn't have to be long, but really think about it. What's your core? What do you believe? What is essential to who you are? Because you are going to be tested, guaranteed, in life. And if you haven't spent that time thinking about and knowing what you believe, you may find that you have done something that you wished you had not done, and it will have slipped away. So figure out, what do you believe? 5, make real friends. It is imperative in life. It is a resource that we need, and make time for those friends. It's virtually a bank account and a treasure into which you make deposits. I have friends, and my best friend, well, I got 3 best friends, but anyway, one of them, I mean, we suddenly realized she was matron of honor at my wedding. We're each other's kids' godmothers, you know. I mean, we're really good friends. The hard part is we don't have anything else left to give each other as presents. So we just give each other more love. But we also realized, we said, it's been 40 years. It did happen rather quickly, trust me. But make those friendships in moments of trial, in moments of whatever you encounter. Those friends will be the support and the backbone. And to make a friend, you do have to be one too. Next, include other. I started by saying include other women in particular, but obviously include other men and women. In other words, bring people along. It is truly not about you. So when you have opportunities, share the wealth. Give the spotlight to others as well. Always bring young people along, because it will help all of humanity as we continue to expand the process. Now, I'm sad to say, in number 7, there are going to be jerks in life. You will encounter them. Please do not be one. That's pretty much what I want to say about it. It is, try really hard to always move to your higher self. My grandmother used to say, well, you know, sometimes when people do things, you know, you may want to be petty and say something about it. Don't. First of all, you never know when it may come back around. But also, I think you'll be happier and more comfortable with yourself if you always try and operate at your higher self. And never, ever send an email in anger. If you do, it will always live forever. Number 8, think about what makes you memorable. I know I've talked to so many students and young people, and I remember one of the earlier times I was giving a commencement address. It was to a, what do you call them? Not quite alternative, but alternative will do. Graduating class. And there were people who were getting, does the GED make any sense here? Okay, good. So they were women who were getting their GEDs. Some of them had been incarcerated. Some of them had been in incredibly violent circumstances. But these were women who were committed to having turned their life around. And I probably was only about 33 or 34 years old myself. So some of them were older than I was at the time. And I remember, for some reason, driving, it was about 120 miles, 160 kilometers away. I don't want to be a typical American. About 160 kilometers away from where I lived. And I just thought about, wow, I wonder if there's anybody who's coming that doesn't necessarily have anybody there supporting them. Because, people were there with their families. And for some reason, the universe just said to me, make some comment of it. I said, even if you are here alone, know and be proud of what you have done. The step you're taking today is such a huge step. I'm proud of you, be proud of yourself. Well, you never know what's going to happen. So after we all had finished and everybody applauded and we went off and we were having our refreshments, a woman came up to me, they touched me on the shoulder and she said, yeah. And I turned around, she had tears in her eyes. And I thought, what is it? And she said, you touched me. And I said, oh, I'm glad. She said, no, you don't understand. She said, every single day, she had to take 3 buses to take her children to a daycare place, then 2 more buses to get back to take the classes. She said, every single person in her family said, you are so stupid. Why are you doing this? It's so dumb of you to do this. It's not going to make any difference in your life. You've always been stupid. Just all kinds of negative energy. She said, in my speech, without knowing her, it was the first time anyone had given her a positive compliment on which to hold. Well, we hugged. And both of us just, tears just ripping down our face after that. But it was a lesson to me that we don't even know sometimes when we are the agents of change, and how such a small thing that we may be doing can actually make such a huge difference in someone's life. So if any of you are still here who were in the session this morning, Chris had asked me to close the session. It was looking at Canadian issues around the oil sands and all kinds of decisions that with the Aboriginal First Nations peoples and how we're going to decide all these things. And I'm not going to go into any of that right now. But he was concerned that possibly the session, which did go extremely well, and if people behaved as well in the halls where in the rooms where they make the decisions, well, we actually could make some really good progress. But that's not this point. He wanted me to leave the audience and to close the globe on a note of hope. So I was sitting there thinking about 2 people who've actually were very, very dear to me who passed away, and I didn't mean to talk about them, but it was Ray Anderson, who was very much an icon in the industrial world, and I worked with Ray for over 16 years. His book, Confessions of a Radical Industrialist, is an amazing work that talks about how to do this at the levels of the company he created. And I still am on the board of Interface and have been on that board for 15 years. But Ray and I we were on the Natural Step Board. We were on about 4 other organization boards together. We traveled to countries all around the world working on issues of sustainability. And the other person was Wangari Maathai. And Wangari and I met for the Earth Summit with Michelle Landsberg, with Vandana Shiva out of India, with Elizabeth May, and through this Congress. And I worked with her for over 20 years. And when she won the Nobel Prize in 2004, I was there in Oslo with her. And they both passed away within 5 weeks of each other. And that was hard last year. That was in August and September. And I had had a chance to introduce them to each other. And Wangari's book, Unbowed, or any of the writings from the Greenbelt movement, which she founded, are so inspiring and inspirational. And when she says I'm humble because I work with people who make you humble, because they're the ones who are really, excuse my French, kicking butt in the world. So he wanted me to say something about both of them because I had worked and known and loved them so well, I hope, and long. And for that, I closed with this quote, and I'm going to close tonight with the same quote. And it's by Maya Angelou, because I think it makes the point. One isn't necessarily born with courage, but one is born with potential. Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, we can't be true, we can't be merciful, generous, or honest, not without courage. So I leave you this evening with hope, but I ask for your courage to change the world. Thank you.